A landslide loss for Jakarta's Christian governor. Ahok is on his way out after elections in Indonesia's capital. Are the nation's hardliners the real winners? Also on today's program, the brutal killing of a 23-year-old student in Pakistan. Are its blasphemy laws emboldening vigilante violence? I'm Imran Garda, and this is the Newsmakers. Jakarta's first non-Muslim governor was held up as proof of Indonesia's diversity and tolerance, but his time at the helm appears to be over. According to early results from the city's elections, the Christian incumbent has suffered a resounding defeat. Ahok's run for re-election was overshadowed by his blasphemy trial and mass protests, which his supporters always argued were politically motivated. And they seem to have brought about an incredible fall from grace for a man who enjoyed widespread support prior to the controversy. So, is this a victory for the former education minister, Anies Baswedan? Or is it a bigger win for Ahok's accusers? Today's Newsmaker is Jakarta's elections, as we ask what impact it's had on the country's religious and racial divides.
It was seen as a test of religious harmony, both for Indonesia's capital and the country as a whole. The race for Jakarta's governorship hasn't gone smoothly. Mass rallies led by hardline groups have called for the incumbent Basuki Cahayapurnama, known popularly as Ahok, to be jailed.
Tangkap Ahok, karena emang apalagi sekarang sudah dibuktikan dia sudah menjadi tersangka.
One in November turned violent. Ahok, an ethnic Chinese Christian, faces blasphemy charges for citing a passage from the Quran last September. He says it was an attempt to dispel the notion among some that Muslims aren't religiously permitted to vote for non-Muslims. Ahok's supporters say that the rallies were planned by his political opponents to sabotage his campaign. Before the protests, Ahok had been polling as high as 52%, which would have clinched the February election outright. Instead, he won the first round with 43%, and now has likely lost to his Muslim runoff opponent, Anies Baswedan, a former Minister of Education and Culture. An unofficial count suggests Baswedan has won. An official tally is expected to be released by the first week of May. Ahok's trial resumes Thursday, the day after the vote. If convicted of blasphemy, he could be sentenced up to 5 years in prison. Issues like Jakarta's chronic flooding, a lack of reliable public transport, and inadequate public housing have played a part in the campaign. But religion and ethnicity have overshadowed the race from the beginning. And with Ahok's possible prosecution looming, some fear those behind the passionate protests that stained his campaign will only be emboldened. Randolph Nogel, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Jakarta is Tobias Basuki. He's a researcher at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Good to talk to you, Tobias. So, Ahok losing, is that a surprise?
Yes, it was a surprise. Of course, after the first round, the conventional wisdom tells that Anies was the front runner, although he was only the runner-up on the result of the first round of elections. But the fact that the margin is about 16 percentage points is definitely a surprise, because Ahok was a very capable and high-performing governor. So that was definitely a surprise to me.
Was this election about politics, or was it about religion and identity?
Of course, on the surface, it looks very much like religion, but in reality, it was politicized religion. It was very clear it's about politics, and it was about entrenched political economic interests against the incumbent governor Ahok, but also against actually the national government. So what we have seen, the huge protests against incumbent governor Ahok in November and December, and leading up to this second round of election where Ahok lost, we can clearly see how religion had been heavily politicized to undermine the credibility and the electability of a again, a governor with a high approval rating of up to 70%.
Yeah, and I want to come back to that, the blasphemy trial and the claims of blasphemy and the millions who had marched against him, because that's not over. And I want to ask you, was he a good governor?
Yes, overall, I think he was a good governor. Of course, he was not perfect, but as a bureaucrat and transforming the bureaucracy of Jakarta in ways never done before, he was actually excellent. He improved the efficiency of the bureaucracy, transparency of the Jakarta budget, development was moving by leaps and bounds. Of course, he had some weaknesses, including the forced evictions of the quartered people of a lower economic class at some regions because of the flooding. So that was part of his weakness, but overall, he was actually a very high-performing governor within the 2 years that he led compared to even all other previous governors.
And what can we look forward to with Anies at the helm?
That would be definitely interesting to look at. I don't think there would be any drastic change with Anies taking the seat in October. In terms of programs and policies, they're quite similar with a few small exceptions. But Anies was always adding a plus to Ahok's program, which means often cash disbursement and other things. So two key questions on Anies would be, can he effectively govern the way Ahok did, and can he actually curb corruption the way Ahok did? And the last part is actually whether all his program promises are sustainable, because a lot of economists are saying that it is not economically feasible. That's on the program and policies. But in regards to how politics and religion is run as an after effect of this election, that's another case. That would be the bigger problem, I would see.
Yeah, and given that Jakarta is the beating heart of Indonesia, what sort of impact will this have on the national politics in the country?
Yes, there's, I think, two rather long-term, medium-term and long-term impacts. We will have the next regional elections in 2018, which includes West Java gubernatorial seat, which is the biggest province in Indonesia, Central Java, East Java, and other regions, and included that will lead up to the 2019 presidential election. And definitely the results of this election has been a steep learning curve for politicians and political parties in Indonesia, that actually utilizing sectarian issues, primordial religious and ethnicity narratives, black campaigns, has proven to be effective even against an incumbent governor who has actually proven a track record and high approval rating in his job as governor. So that's the bad part, that this type of narrative will continue on to other regions. And the longer term effect is actually the narrative of Islamist radicals that are trying to co-opt Indonesian political Islam may gain further ground. That is completely opposite of Indonesian Islam. For example, in this case, the legitimacy of a non-Muslim governor. That's something that has never been a problem in Indonesia, but it is now. And
you know, 7 million people took to the streets to protest against Ahok for alleged blasphemy. And I guess, you know, some voters might not have been one of those people out on the streets, but they might have thought, hey, I might not want to vote for somebody who could end up in jail because there wasn't a verdict yet, so maybe I'm going to play it safe and vote for Anies. With that in mind, what can we expect in terms of a verdict? Is Ahok going to end up in prison?
Well, first of all, there were actually, it was a misnomer. The candidate Anies Baswedan claimed also a wrong number. 7 million was not the number. It was actually more like less than 400,000. So that being said, of course, the court verdict, not the verdict yet, but the charges by the prosecution, which comes up tomorrow, will be very, very heavily influenced by this actually outcome. And the fact that Ahok lost will probably prove that most likely the prosecution will charge at a higher level, at a higher sentence. But that being said, there's a lot that will still happen. The processing of the further evidence and court battle will be ongoing, which until now the blasphemy charge against Ahok had been very done in a very rapid manner, which is unusual. Blasphemy court cases usually take up to 2 years. So after this, it's going to be an elongated further court trial after the charges are made. And that will prove that it will be less heated than before the gubernatorial election.
And I was reading reports that in the neighborhoods of Jakarta, there were banners claiming that Muslims who vote for Ahok will be denied burial rights. And, you know, there were all sorts of sort of hidden, you know, and not so hidden threats. In many ways, it made his point for him. The very thing that he said that got him in trouble, it essentially made his point for him. So some people have lit the flame of religious tension here. Is it going to be easy to extinguish that?
It's not going to be easy. Of course, I think so-called the fear of extreme radical Islamism is, I think, not too big of a threat because there are small groups in Indonesia. But the fact that the narrative that they had used had been proven effective is where it's hard. Now, actually, the majority of the Indonesian Muslims and Jakartan Muslims who are actually pluralist and open-minded has been further pushed back using this kind of narratives, this kind of threats of not praying for those who voted for Ahok, and threats of other things, of religious threats, which Anies Baswedan, by the way, did say quite outrightly, explicitly the day before the election and also today.
Is Indonesia still a country where Indonesians who are Christian or Indonesians of Chinese descent can campaign and feel they have a chance of winning?
Well, we had a much progress after the '98 Reformation, and I don't think it changes much now. But definitely, there's more pessimism. I think people of minority, whether ethnicity or religion, in various areas, will be much more less optimistic in their chances precisely because of this. If someone with such a proven record can be taken down, what about someone who actually has no track record yet? That's going to be very tough. So that's the biggest challenge that we will face further into the future.
Fascinating times in Indonesia. We don't cover Indonesia often enough, and I hope we do in the future. It's been good to talk to you, Tobias Basuki, joining us there. He called himself the humanist. On Facebook, Pakistani student Mashal Khan spoke up for people who felt ostracized for being different. Whether it was skin color or sexual identity, he condemned their mistreatment, saying it stemmed from fear. Last week, that voice of comfort was silenced. His fellow students accused him of blasphemy and bashed him to death in a sickening assault. He's the latest victim in a society where a law that prohibits blasphemy is sometimes used by vigilantes to justify murder. But despite the dangers, protesters say enough is enough. Yvette McCullough reports.
It began as a university dorm room debate. It ended in a lynch mob killing. This chilling footage shows 23-year-old Mashal Khan being shot and beaten to death by his fellow students over accusations he'd committed blasphemy against Islam. The latest victim of vigilante justice in Pakistan. Several of those allegedly involved have been charged with murder, and there are reports the blasphemy claims were made up as an excuse to target him.
A great atrocity has been committed. I think this is barbarity. If our young generation gets so infuriated that they start killing people, then I think our country and society will start moving in a very bad direction.
Pakistan's blasphemy laws were introduced in the 1980s. They carry the death penalty for defaming the Prophet Muhammad, or life imprisonment for insulting the Quran. But activists say the laws are abused, with people falsely accused to settle personal scores or to target minorities, and say it encourages people to take the law into their own hands. At least 65 people have been murdered over allegations of blasphemy since 1990. Most Pakistanis believe blasphemy should be punished in some way. Last year, thousands came out to protest the execution of Mumtaz Qadri, who killed a Punjab governor in 2011 over his calls for blasphemy law reforms. Pakistani Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif said he is shocked and saddened by this senseless display of mob justice and promised that those involved would be punished. But his own government has been accused of loudly beating the blasphemy drum, emboldening religious extremists. With blasphemy invoking such a passionate response in Pakistan, should the government reconsider its approach? And should the laws be changed to help prevent them from being misused? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Karachi by Mohammed Gibran Nasser. He's a lawyer and a civil liberty activist. And here with me in the studio is TRT World journalist Shoaib Hassan, who's been following this story closely and has covered Pakistan for many years. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Gibran Nasser, let me start with you. Shocking situation with Mashal Khan. Incredible images, that have been shared all over the world, hitting people's social media feeds, a lynching basically, in the flesh that they're watching. Many people asking why, how, who's to blame, what's to blame, who do you blame and what do you blame?
Imran, while I was waiting to interview with you, I was surrounded by the beautiful sound of the evening azan, which says, come towards prosperity, come towards success. But unfortunately, we Muslims, due to our intolerance, feeded by our own ignorance, have done a great injustice to the glory and the legacy of our beloved Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And who I blame right now is our society as a whole. Just like Mashal's parent did not send their son to the university to get murdered, I'm pretty sure that other parents also did not send their child to the university to become a murderer. It's been our policies in which we have weaponized religion. It's been our policy in which we have shut down dialogue and discourse on religion. And it's been our policies where we have used religion to meet political and economic ends, that it has fallen in the hands of people who have ulterior motives, who brainwash young children, who take the opportunity of these weak moments and then instigate violence. And it's very strange that why is Pakistan the only country right now which somehow feels that it is a flag bearer of Islam? If you look at Turkey, which has a sizable Muslim population, or if you look at other countries like Qatar, Bahrain, Algeria, Libya, Jordan, Kuwait, or Oman, none of them have the death penalty for the blasphemy law.
Gibran, let me come in here for a second.
We also need to talk about reforms here.
Sure, okay, let's talk about reforms as well. But let me come in here. You hold society as a whole responsible. It's hard to hold society as a whole to account. So if you could narrow that down for me, if you could give me a figure or an ideology or a group that is more responsible than others, who would that be?
I would say first and foremost, primarily those sitting in the parliament, the 342 parliamentarians sitting in the National Assembly who have our votes, who are elected democratically, but they undermine their own power and not start a discussion on this. For most part, we've been seeing in Pakistan that the blasphemy law has been used to target minorities, but if we only look at the figures in the recent years, in the most populous province of Punjab, out of 1296 cases, 1195 blasphemy cases were registered by Muslims against other Muslims. This has become a tool to settle personal scores. Right. And those people who are sitting in the parliament refusing to talk about reforms, even right now, all leaders in Pakistan are talking about punishment for those who killed Mashal. They're not talking about reforms right now, which is the need of the hour, which is a long-term solution.
Right. So, Shoaib, this blasphemy law, can it still survive in a good form? Can it still be sort of representative of a set of values, that the set of sacred values enshrined in law, and that it might not be instrumentalized by extremists, that it can be used in the right way?
At the moment, there is no right or wrong way as far as the blasphemy law is concerned. It's because it's not the blasphemy law that you can really blame. In fact, and also the fact that we should just go back, that these people were lynched. They were not actually tried and killed by courts. It's the fact that there is a breakdown of the judicial system in Pakistan, and that the judicial system is not really exercising its own innate right to interpret this law. That's the problem.
Okay, so then let's ask Gibran. Gibran, I'll ask you the same question slightly differently. Can the blasphemy law exist judiciously and legitimately without being instrumentalized and without being used by lynch mobs?
Most definitely it can. What we need besides reforms is also awareness amongst the masses that what really is the blasphemy law, who can implement it. We have people, non-state actors, often supported by our military establishment and our political parties, who go out on the streets and say that we have the right to take law in our own hands, and if the courts aren't punishing anybody, let's do it ourselves. We have a very tragic example back in the 90s when a 14-year-old was acquitted by a sitting judge of the Lahore High Court under a false blasphemy allegation. Later, a man came forward and killed that judge for acquitting that man. So when we have this message and this education being spread in the masses that if anybody has been accused of blasphemy, they have to be guilty and there is no other way, that's also problematic. When you talk about reforms, there are three kinds of things you can do. There's procedural reforms, substantive reforms, and the repeal. Let me just talk about procedural reform here. In Pakistan, if today I have to go and book a case against somebody who is indulging in hate speech, who's calling me an infidel or instigating violence against me, I can't do that. Only the state has the right to register a FIR or a case for hate speech. But for blasphemy, anybody can go and make a claim and register a case. We have allowed it to be used as a toy in the hands of the common masses. So just like for hate speech, the government can take the onus on themselves for registering criminal cases. Why can't we do the same thing with blasphemy? And further and foremost, why does Pakistan have the authority to make such draconian laws in the name of Islam? Because Islam is not exclusive to Pakistan. This is a global issue of the entire Muslim Ummah. I also appeal to the clerics around the world to also feed in and educated clerics back home here that the way we have implemented law as opposed to the other world is wrong.
And Shoaib, some of this seems to be sort of bottom up rather than top down when it comes to blasphemy. And it's a very hot potato issue. But for example, looking at the pressure on Facebook to remove blasphemous content, looking at it as an outsider and doing my reading, it seemed as if the pressure came from ordinary people saying we don't want blasphemous content on our social media feeds, which then bubbled up to government, which said we must do something about it rather than the other way around. In a democracy, doesn't this need to be taken into account?
It needs to be taken into account, and definitely there is a sentiment within Pakistan's uneducated or poorly educated masses that Islam is under threat and that it needs to be protected, and that if the government can do it, we have to go out and do something about it. That's why Mashal Khan was killed. There may be other reasons for it, but the principal reason was because the people who killed him felt that the state is not going to do anything, and this is a common thread in the conversation as far as the religious groups are concerned. That the state doesn't hang anybody, it hasn't punished anybody for blasphemy, it hasn't punished Asia Bibi, who was due to whose case the governor Salman Taseer was killed, and it hasn't hanged anybody over the years. This is the argument they use. So we have to go out and we have to take the law in its own hand. But when that settlement comes up, the government lets it come up, and it lets it just go out and do whatever it wants to do. It doesn't try to stop it. It doesn't try to prevent these incidents from happening. And sometimes there are government lawmakers who come up, and I'm sure Gibran will agree with me, who say, well, that guy shouldn't have said this, or this person shouldn't have said this. They should have, not that they are to blame.
Okay, so let me look for a silver lining here. Gibran, those sheikhs who wanted to disrupt the man's funeral were charged, right? So the law came in and did its job and tried to prevent those people who wanted to disrupt this man. It wasn't bad enough that he was lynched, they wanted to mess up his funeral. Are you encouraged by the fact that they were charged?
Imran, as I speak to you right now, in the past few months, when you talked about the issue of blasphemous content on social media, in that controversy, I was also accused by an anchor sitting on primetime television in Pakistan, and also by various clerics around the country. I, by chance, have been exposed to the threat of mob lynching while I sit here and talk to you. The reason and the problem here is that we act as a reactionary state. The law comes into motion, and we talk about changing things and make bold statements only after an innocent has been lynched, and we cannot somehow hide our face from that barbarity which has occurred. What we need to talk about right now is not just talk about retribution. We need to talk about deterrence, and for that we need awareness and we need reform. This is the right time for the leadership of Pakistan to show their true mettle and dedicate their efforts in the memory of Mashal and various other innocents who've been killed, rather than just talk about punishing those, because we also have a tradition in Pakistan of glorifying those people who have been judiciously hanged and declared terrorists because they had killed accused blasphemers, and they've been turned into heroes.
Let me ask you then, right? if the government goes and, say, destroys the shrine of Qadri, the man who killed Salman Taseer, destroys the shrine, wouldn't it make things worse and create more extremism? To what extent does the government have to say, hey, we don't like this, we don't like the fact that people are venerating a convicted killer, but what are you going to do about it? You destroy the shrine, you create more extremists, don't you?
You see, the thing is that, again, at times, use of force and direct force and brutal force does end up creating, stopping avenues for dialogue and does create extremists, like you rightly pointed out. But what they can monitor right now in the first stage is all those people and all those groups who take the excuse of Mumtaz Qadri to instigate other people to kill accused blasphemers. That hate speech could be stopped. That literature could be stopped. Those people could be booked for hate speech cases. At the end of the day, Mumtaz Qadri's shrine may end up being an empty haunted house, so that all I care. But the point is that symbol is being used by that curriculum or by that education or by those sermons or by those speeches which are being taught over there and how it is being used as a symbol. So just because it exists and just by breaking down those walls, we will not actually end extremism. We'll only end extremism once we curtail the spread of hate speech and once we provide an alternative narrative where we empower clerics who are willing to talk openly on this issue. Various clerics who have openly opposed the blasphemy law and how it's used have been forced to leave the country and there hasn't been any protection from them. Similar things happened to senators and members of National Assembly who had to leave the country and then go on other official duties as an excuse because their lives are endangered. Our military apparatus, our political apparatus needs to come together to empower the judiciary, the clerics, the media persons, and the parliamentarians who are willing to take a step and do legislation to curtail the rise and spread of hate speech and this hate narrative.
Okay, I wish we could go on, but unfortunately we can't. We're out of time. Gibran, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and Shoaib as well. Thanks so much. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.